Welcome to the Marshall University One Room School Museum. I'm Dr. Paul Lutz, Professor Emeritus of History here at Marshall, and the developer and longtime director of the One Room School Museum. Interestingly enough, before there was a One Room School project, there was another project. I had students in class, and one student came up to finalize the topic, and she said, instead of doing a typical term paper, is it okay if I interview my next door neighbor? And I said, well, okay, what makes her so interesting? And she said, well, she's a former one-room school teacher, and when she found out I was majoring in teacher education, every time she sees me, she wants to talk about her years as a one-room school. So we came up with 6 or 8 questions, and she took one of the cassette tapes. Now this is 1990 now, this is way back. And so a couple of months later, she turned her paper in, and I read the paper, listened to the tape, and I thought, wow, how cool is this? And I began to wonder how many more of these one-room school teachers are still out there. Mind you now, this is 1990. So a person born even in 1930 and receiving a degree, teaching degree in 1952, there were lots of one-room schools still open in West Virginia. And much of that is due to the terrain and all the hills and hollers and so on. And you didn't have school buses for the most part. At least they couldn't get up the hollers. So there were one-room schools scattered all across the state of West Virginia. At one time, there was a school census in 1930, and they counted over 4,000 one-room schools across the state. When a person got a degree, it wasn't unusual for new teachers to be sent way out into the boondocks. And so I began asking other students, this is your assignment, find a former one-room school teacher, interview her or him, and there were a lot of men teaching back then. And so over the next 4 years, we interviewed just under 400 former one-room school teachers. And along the way, we asked them, do you have any memorabilia that we might have? Well, my West Virginia history students, about 60 each per semester, all of a sudden we started getting memorabilia everywhere. I had it stacked up in my office, books and whatever, and people call and say, I have one of the old desks. So I thought maybe we could get a display area over Morrow Library. And these things kept coming in so fast that one student said, Dr. Lutz, looks like we need a building, a one-room school building on campus. So I began to think about that. And so if it weren't for a student's question about interviewing her next door neighbor and another student saying, since we've got so much stuff, let's see if we can find a building, we wouldn't have a one-room school project. There was one teacher and oftentimes either 6 or 8 grades all in one room. And you had 2 or 3 first graders and 2 or 3 second graders and 3 or 4 third graders and so on. And oftentimes there were only 4 or 5 families represented. And when all these desks, people started calling me saying, can you use a desk? I said, well, sure. So every desk in here was donated. And it's amazing that when they started coming in, we got 2 or 3 really small ones for little kids, and then the desks got a little bigger for maybe the 3rd, 4th graders, and then right here, fifth, sixth graders, and it was just absolutely amazing. You know, this is what this school would have looked like. It's a reflection on Appalachia especially. Of course, you know, a lot of places have one-room schools, but because of the geography of Appalachia, you know, we had schools open. I think the last one was up in Calhoun County or Central West Virginia, 1973. They were still open. And Wayne County nearby had one open until 1967. I think people need to understand that the, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic kind of thing. Of course, now, you know, we're talking decades ago, and you could get 6 or 8 grades completed, and by those times, you know, pretty well educated. And some of the books that we've received, if you start looking at those, it's really demanding, you know, work, thorough work. One of the big things now is people talk about peer tutoring, you know, students helping other students. That all started right here. The teacher could only work with so many students at one time. So oftentimes, while she was working maybe with third or fourth graders, some of the older students would come over and work with the first graders or second graders. So that's where that started. And there was a lot of recitation at every level. You know, each student would stand up and recite whatever it is, ABCs or a poem or whatever. And everybody was listening to that. So there was a lot of learning going on by kind of osmosis, you know, just absorbing all that. And so kids got for those times, a very thorough education, reading and writing, and you know, and we've kind of gone back to some of that thinking too, even in the digital age. They tried to build these things so students wouldn't have to walk more than 2 miles. And oftentimes, you might only have 4 or 5 families represented. You know, two or three Lutz kids and 2 or 3 Powell kids, and you know, and they talked about this community, this tight, you know, community mentality. And in some areas, we even had some teachers tell us that their school was so remote that they would go and stay with families of their students. You know, there were very few behavioral issues because if the teacher had to tell your parents, if you got a paddling at school, you're going to get more than that at home. And kids said, "Oh, please don't tell Ma or don't tell Pa. You know, I'll get a worse whipping when I get home." So the issue was, how do I find an actual building? You know, and it took me 4 years, and this is the 4th school that I located. The first school was out in Wayne County. And I called the superintendent. Some people told me about it, went out and looked at it. He said, "Sure, you can have it." A few months later, a fella called me and he said, "You that professor feller that wants that old schoolhouse?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You don't want it now. Somebody torched it last night." So I thought, oh no, you know. So it was almost a year later, I found a second schoolhouse out in Milton, and the Boy Scouts were using it. And the owner says, "Oh yeah, you can have it." Well, a few weeks later, I got a call from President Gilley. He says, "Paul," he says, "every Boy Scout leader and official in the tri-state and state of West Virginia have been calling me, you know, 'Oh, please don't take our schoolhouse. You know, we've had that, the Boy Scouts have had that for years.'" So that was 2 down. Another year, I found a third building, and it was out on 8th Street Road near Huntington Galleries, the museum. And the fellow who owned it was a Marshall grad. He said, "Oh yeah, sure, you can have it." He says, "But I've got a little church group using it right now, and I don't have the heart to tell them they have to get out. But as soon as they leave, it's yours." Well, how long would that be? We didn't know. So I kind of put that on the back burner. And this is 3 years into this project. And one of my wife's colleagues at Cox Landing Elementary, where she was teaching, they were just casual conversation one day, and she said, "My husband, I'm afraid he's going to slit his throat. This has been a 3-year project so far, and he's getting really upset about it." She said, "Well, I know where one is." So we went up Route 2, past the Jenkins plantation, and turned onto Guyan Creek Road and meandered around about 3 miles, and sure enough, there it was. Of course, it didn't look like this, but it was structurally sound because they had been using it for storage. So a fellow nearby said, "Mrs. Bryan owns it, and she lives down the road in the brick house, the only brick house on Guyan Creek Road." So I went down and talked to her, explained who I was and what we wanted. She says, "My daughter is a secretary in the College of Education." I said, "Oh, I know her." He says, "You can have the darn thing anytime you want it." So this was early 1995. And so the third time was not the charm, the fourth time was the charm to get this building. And so I went to see my chairman of my department to get her okay, went to see the dean, College of Education. She said, "That's okay, but you need to go see the president." So I went to see Dr. Gilley, and I was really nervous. He said, "That's a great idea, Paul." He said, "My wife and I went to one-room schools in Virginia." And he says, "But," and I knew what the but was. There's no university money for this. I said, "Don't worry. I know some people who are interested in this." And one of those people was Phil Klein, who recently passed away. And Phil, who was a big Marshall supporter and patron, his mom and dad had been one-room school students and one-room school teachers down in eastern Kentucky. And he was so excited about the program. And so he said, "Just do it and I'll pay it." So we got a mover, and this is 23 miles now up Route 2. And Guyan Creek Road was about 20 feet wide. Well, that's what the building is. So we had the mover go out, and it took us 4 hours to go 3 miles to get to Route 2. And it was touch and go. They had to cut limbs off of trees, remove mailboxes. And this thing, they slid a big trailer, metal dolly kind of thing underneath it. And every time that building moved, it creaked. I thought, "Oh no, please don't fall apart." And so we finally got it out to Route 2, and then the state police were there, and that was easy, straight down Route 2, 20 miles. And had to park it up here. Well, it's kind of where that indoor football facility is, up around the McDonald's, that area. And we had to park it up there because, this site had not been created. But the interesting thing about the site is that in the long-range plan, this was to be a green space. And so I said, "I've got something for the green space, the one-room school." So everything just fell into place, finally. Lord taught me a great deal of patience in a 4-year project. So, you know, it's, everybody says, oh, that's great. Boy, I bet that was fun to do. And yes, it was. But at times it was exasperating. But, you know, Marshall began as a teacher's college. And in fact, it began in one room. It shared with the Methodist church, I think. And the one-room log building was over at the present-day site of Old Main. So this is part of our heritage. You know, Marshall began in a one-room building, and this is you know, representative of that. So it's been fun, and everything you see in here. Of course, it was renovated, but it's all original. The floor is original. All these chairs, Peabody desks they're called, they're original. Potbelly stove was in the building when we found it. It was kind of rusty orange looking. Obviously, we had to put some new windows in and a roof, and it was painted, but it's not a replica. I mean, this is the honest to gosh, you know, building representative, you know, 1900 or a little bit earlier. One of the teachers my students interviewed taught in the building, and then later on she came down. This little tiny, little white-haired lady, must have been, I don't know, 80s or something, and she kind of walked around the room, and she'd point to a desk, and she says, "Oh, that's where that little Billy's whoever sat. He was the honest kid I ever saw." And you know, this was 50, 60 years ago. How in the world should you remember names of students? And then she'd say, "Oh, that pretty little Rachel sat over here, and she was the sweetest child." I thought, what a memory. Yeah. But it was, you know, it was kind of a family thing. You know, she remembered all those students. So, yeah, it's an amazing story, and I'm just blessed to have been a part of it. Brad Smith, you know, he insists you don't call him President Smith. He says, "Call me Brad," which has kind of been a little hard to do, but you know, nonetheless, he came over here 2 years ago, right when he'd gotten here, and I invited him, and I thought, oh, he'll stay 10 minutes. He was here 40 minutes, and he was just amazed by all this, and he had questions. I mean, I would just barely get one answered. He would have another question. And over here, my daughter, Meredith, who's a Marshall graduate. Of course, my son, Aaron, is a Marshall graduate. My wife, Mary, is a Marshall graduate. We have 7 degrees, you know, the 4 of us from Marshall. But my daughter, Meredith, put that together for me, and those are pictures of the day President Smith came over. He was, you know, he told me flat out. He says, "If you need anything for the one-room school, just let me know." You know, he was that impressed with it. So.